Well, let's turn our attentions to southern Africa now and Zimbabwe. President Robert Mugabe has called on the country's remaining white farmers to cede their land to black people. He maintains that such a policy continues a noble tradition of rehearsing colonial injustices. His critics, though, say his policy of seizing most of Zimbabwe's white-owned farms is exactly what triggered and then accelerated the country's economic collapse between 2000 and 2009. Well, joining me to discuss Mugabe and his policies are the former editor of Ghana's biggest-selling newspaper, The Daily Graphic, that's Cameron Duodu. And also with me is John Ofeansa, the publisher of the Pan-African news magazine, African Briefing. John, I want to turn to you first. Does Mugabe even have any legs at all for this call?
Well, he does. Otherwise, he wouldn't be making such calls. But the fact is, Mugabe had a point, all along. And, he had the support of most African leaders, in trying to correct a colonial injustice, whereby less than a third of the population owned, more than 2/3 of the most arable land in Zimbabwe. So it was a colonial injustice he needed to correct. But having said that, but what most people like me, or where we disagree, was or is the mode of implementation. One particular aspect of it is letting loose the so-called war veterans to invade, the white farms, and be violent towards
Exactly. Mugabe has never, ever done anything without a whole host of henchmen and with a reign of terror, effectively. Well,
I wouldn't call it the reign of terror, but as they say, the popular saying, a hungry man is always...
a dictator.
It's always an angry man, yeah. And I wouldn't believe, but he should have reined in those war veterans who unleashed violence on the white farmers. Okay, and again, since the end of the land reform program, most of the beneficiaries of the lands have partnered, funny enough, ironically, have partnered with some of these white farmers.
Okay, John, I'm going to go to Cameron first now. Some people are saying that this is a distraction for the economic crisis that is facing Zimbabwe because there's very high unemployment and the banks are toxic at the moment.
That is true. But if you ask Mugabe, he would tell you that that was the price to be paid for gaining control of the economy. What people forget is that Mugabe started as a teacher and a trade unionist and was imprisoned by the whites for merely talking about freedom. Joshua Nkomo of the other party, ZAPU, was also imprisoned. Anyone who spoke about democratically getting back the rights which had been seized by the British with arms, remember, with arms, was imprisoned. So they formed a guerrilla army to show force against the white people's force. And they won the victory, and they were brought to London to negotiate. They negotiated under duress. They didn't want to actually stop the war and agree on a piece of paper. But they had to do that. Now, that was 30 years ago. So Mugabe is now 90 years old. And he wants his children to be able to say, our father led the movement that got us back our land that was stolen.
John, we know that a number of the white farmers have used their business nows to contribute to the economy. They've done a lot for Zimbabwe itself by putting funds back in, by managing the farms very well. Isn't there a point to be sort of upheld there? Yeah,
cumulatively, the Zimbabwe farmers, white Zimbabwe farmers, have 100 years experience, in farming in that country, cumulatively, right? So, personally, I don't see anything wrong in the land beneficiaries. If some of them are top parties, ZANU-PF, ruling parties, ZANU-PF officials, some are ministers who have some have leased some of the lands back to the whites, while others have partnered with them, right? But the fact is, right now, none of them, those who lost their farms, own land. They get them on lease. And there's a difference between outright ownership and owning a lease.
But
Okay.
by spouting this sort of rhetoric, Cameron, are we not in danger of stirring up racial tensions again?
Well, there was racial tension there before independence.
But it doesn't help when it's the president doing that.
But help whom? The
country of Zimbabwe.
Well, exactly. The country must belong to the people who form the majority of the population. And if you give privileges, and if you know the methods used by the whites to get the lands, you wouldn't even be discussing it. One king was asked by Cecil Rhodes and company to give them a lot of land. He didn't understand English. They brought a missionary whom they had bribed to try, who spoke the language, to explain to the king what they wanted. And what he told the king and what he told them were completely different. The British Parliament here set up a British charter company for Cecil Rhodes with all the might of the British Empire to go and collect the land.
We can't rewrite history, unfortunately.
Well, guerrillas don't believe that. They think they should rewrite history.
However,
And that is what people don't understand
how do
about
we move forward, and what would be the implications, John, maybe for international interference? Would there be any kind of backlash that would come back on Mugabe?
Well, the backlash arrived, since 2002 when the land reform program, set in full swing. I mean, the West will tell you that they hadn't placed any sanctions on Zimbabwe. They have. I lived in Zimbabwe the whole of 2003, and I had a friend, a black Zimbabwean friend, who owned a rose farm, was looking for export markets. And in trying to help me, I called some companies here in the UK here, who told me bluntly, categorically, that no, we cannot touch flowers from Zimbabwe. This is one example.
I mean, his track record, though, as a leader, is hardly squeaky clean.
You see, my problem is with the West. If the West don't like your policies, okay, no matter what you do, how well-intentioned you are to do the right thing for your people, you are demonized by the West.
Sure, but if he was more transparent, maybe more journalists would go to Zimbabwe, but we can't. We're banned.
I go to Zimbabwe. I was there 2003 as a
But if
consultant.
I applied, I wouldn't be allowed to go.
Right, and I was there. I've been there 3 times since my return, as a foreign journalist. So.
Okay, well, let's look at the general health of Zimbabwe. He's been in power a very long time. I think since 1987, since Christmas 1987. What a Christmas that was, Cameron.
Well, look, when you reduce a people to the level of fighting in the mountains in order to gain possession of their democratic rights, you have no right to then begin to dictate to them how they should acquire those rights. Mugabe, I'm afraid, is a bit of an ideologist. He's just too determined to enforce an
Some people
ideology.
would say a despot.
What is a despot? He got 61% of the vote.
Do we know that whether that was a legitimate vote? We don't know about corruption, about vote rigging, allegedly.
Well, he had the opposition in a coalition government with him. And the number of people who go to the polls in Zimbabwe is about twice the number.
We know that
go to the
Mugabe
polls
has used alleged force towards his opposition.
He made a mistake in Matabeleland. That was a horrendous mistake. About 20,000 people were killed for political power. It was a mistake, and it will be a blot on his reputation forever. But
I think it's a bit more than a blot.
Oh, well, all right. What else? I mean, a stain. If you want me to bring thesaurus, I'll go for it. But seriously, it was a terrible mistake. But the point is this, that in history, land is the most important thing in Southern Africa because of the way it was acquired.
In all of Africa, I think, yes.
Well, in West Africa, they died not because the mosquito was killing them off the land.
Okay, final question to you, John, briefly. Do you think by Mugabe saying to white farmers to give the farms back to the black population, How is this going to impact on the economy, and how will this fare in the long term for Zimbabwe?
You know what? The economy...
Briefly.
Economy is already in the doldrums. Okay, and one thing he mentioned that we forget to pick up, that the whites must go to industry. Okay, so it was like an olive branch to the white. Must go to, it's not say the whites must leave Zimbabwe, but they must go to industry. That's one point that we forgot to pick up there. So the omens are not all that ominous.
Okay, Cameron, John, thank you very much for your thoughts.